There's something about divorce that shows you exactly who people really are. Before I went through my own, I never fully understood why friends of divorcing couples always seem to disappear. You think you're close enough that it won't matter, that the friendships will stay intact no matter what. But when the split happens, especially one that drags on for years, people pick sides. Even if you never ask them to. Even if you never say a word. About a decade ago, I was in exactly that position. My ex and I had been together long enough that our social circles were intertwined. Game nights, dinner parties, holidays spent together. It all blurred into this comfortable, communal routine. When things started to unravel, I told myself we were mature enough not to make it awkward for everyone else. No ultimatums, no pitting people against each other. But I underestimated how uncomfortable other people get around other people's pain. It wasn't immediate. At first, everyone tried to be polite, neutral. They'd still send invites to both of us. They'd still text occasionally. But as the months stretched on, and the split turned from temporary to permanent, something shifted. Little by little, the messages slowed down. The dinner invitations stopped coming. Some people quietly unfollowed me on social media. I told myself it was normal, understandable. Most of them were my ex's friends first, before I ever knew them. Still, it stung to realize that years of shared memories could just evaporate when it became inconvenient to stay in touch. There were a couple of exceptions, mostly the wives, who stayed cordial, even friendly. But we were never best friends, and I didn't expect them to be. So I focused on rebuilding my life. I found new circles, threw myself into work, and started over. I'd love to say I never thought about that old friend group again, but that wouldn't be true. Sometimes, late at night, I'd remember how easily they'd all drifted away, and I'd wonder if it had ever meant as much to them as it did to me. When you're going through a divorce, you brace yourself for the big things. The paperwork, the money conversations, the splitting up of homes and lives and plans. But what catches you off guard are the small humiliations you don't see coming. For me, it was the first time I ran into one of my ex's friends after we'd separated. It was maybe 8 months in, past the point where I was crying every morning but still raw enough that unexpected encounters felt like an ambush. We were at a fundraiser I'd always attended with my ex. It was one of those charity events with a silent auction, a band, and the same faces every year. When I walked into the lobby, I spotted a couple from our old group. I smiled, feeling a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, some of these connections would survive the divorce. I raised a hand in greeting. The woman nodded politely. The man looked me straight in the face, then turned away as if I'd never spoken. It was such a small gesture, a split-second decision, but it felt like a door slamming shut. That was the moment I realized people don't always need a reason to write you out of their story. Sometimes it's easier for them if you simply disappear. After that, I stopped going to events I knew they'd be at. I didn't want to keep tallying who pretended not to see me. Then came the night my ex invited me to a professional event he was hosting. He said he wanted to show goodwill, one last attempt to prove we could end things amicably. He even reserved me a VIP ticket and experience. I didn't have any illusions that we were going to reconcile, but I accepted because part of me was tired of avoiding places and people. I wanted to reclaim a little normalcy. When I arrived, the staff escorted me to the VIP room to collect my credentials. I was trying to stay calm, telling myself I could handle whatever awkwardness came my way. That's when I saw him. The same man from before, the one who'd turned away at the fundraiser. He was standing by the bar, talking to another guest. I reminded myself that I had nothing to be ashamed of. I hadn't done anything to warrant being treated like a ghost. So I walked over, made eye contact and said, "Hi." He looked at me, really looked, and for a split second I thought maybe he'd soften. Maybe he'd at least nod or say something polite. But instead he just stared, face blank. Then, without a word, he stepped aside and walked around me like I was a piece of furniture in his way. I stood there for a moment, trying to keep my expression neutral. Inside, I was furious. This was someone I'd welcomed into my home. Someone I'd cooked for, played board games with, helped when his family needed pet sitting. Someone who'd never hesitated to accept my kindness, until it became inconvenient to be associated with me. That was the last time I tried to reach across that divide. After that night, I let it go. I moved on, built new friendships, and poured my energy into my career and my own healing. Years passed. I remarried. I built a life I was proud of. I stopped wondering whether I'd ever run into any of them again. So when his name popped up in my inbox, years later, long after I'd stopped caring, I almost didn't recognize it, until I read the first line. It's been a long time since we've connected. Hope all is well. And then it all came flooding back. The fundraiser, the blank stare, the silent rejection. And there he was, acting like we were old friends. I sat there staring at the email, reading the words over and over. It's been a long time since we've connected. Hope all is well. By the way, I just applied for a job at your firm and listed you as a referral. Hope you can put in a good word for me. The gall of it almost made me laugh. It was surreal, really, like he'd erased everything that had happened between us. As if we were still the same warm acquaintances who shared dinners and game nights. As if he hadn't spent years pretending I didn't exist. At first, my instinct was to ignore it. Just delete the message and move on. After all, I'd worked hard to get to a place where he was a non-entity in my life. He'd done me the favor of disappearing, and I'd been perfectly fine without him. But the more I sat with it, the more it grated. This wasn't just some old friend reaching out to reconnect. This was a man who had looked me dead in the eye at one of the most vulnerable moments in my life, and decided I didn't matter. And now, years later, he wanted to leverage my name, my reputation, and my professional standing because he was desperate for a job. I tried to imagine the thought process that led him to hit send on that email. Sure, I never spoke to her again after the divorce. And yeah, I walked around her like she was invisible. But she'll definitely vouch for me now that I'm struggling. It was almost impressive. I clicked over to LinkedIn out of curiosity. His profile confirmed what the email hinted at. He'd been job hunting for a while, probably with no luck. And suddenly, I realized this wasn't about reconnecting. This was about convenience. He didn't want to rebuild any bridge between us. He just wanted to walk across whatever was left of it to rescue himself. I thought about how I would have felt if the situation were reversed. If I had burned that bridge so thoroughly that I couldn't even muster a nod hello, and then years later expected him to pretend it never happened. I'd never have had the nerve. But here he was, assuming that my decency would override my memory. I closed my laptop and sat there, feeling that old anger twist into something sharper. No, I wasn't going to ignore this. Ignoring it would mean letting him walk away thinking his behavior had no consequences. Ignoring it would mean I was still willing to be the bigger person, again, for someone who had never offered me the smallest shred of respect. I thought about how many times I'd swallowed my pride during the divorce, how often I tried to be gracious to people who treated me like an inconvenience. Not this time. This time, I didn't know him anything. I didn't know him a response. I didn't know him my reputation. What I owed to myself was honesty. Honesty about the fact that he had burned that bridge beyond repair. And honesty about the fact that no matter how small it might seem, this was a line I wasn't going to let him cross. I decided then and there that I wasn't just going to decline to help him. I was going to make it very clear that I would not, under any circumstances, be offering a referral. Because some lessons are best learned the hard way. Once I decided I wasn't going to help him, a weight lifted off my shoulders. It's funny. Sometimes you don't realize how much you've been conditioned to be accommodating until you finally choose not to be. I'd spent years swallowing discomfort to avoid making things awkward. Years convincing myself that politeness was more important than principle. But this time I felt no guilt, just a clear sense of relief. I reopened the email and reread it, looking for any nuance I might have missed. But there was none. It was breezy, presumptuous, and entirely lacking any acknowledgement of the past. If he'd said something, anything, that suggested self-awareness, maybe I'd have considered at least responding politely. If he'd written, "I know things ended badly, and I regret how I acted. I understand if you can't help, but I'm reaching out because I'm in a tough spot." Even then, I wouldn't have vouched for him, but at least it would have shown he understood what he'd done. Instead, he tried to pretend none of it had happened. That alone sealed my decision. I knew that in our firm, references mattered. A lot. An internal referral didn't guarantee a hire, but it almost always guaranteed at least a first interview. And if I said nothing, HR would assume my silence meant tacit approval. So, I drafted a short email to our HR coordinator. I kept it professional.
Noi mouschen, no backstory.
Hi, HR name. I'm writing to clarify that although his name listed me as a reference on his recent application, I am not comfortable endorsing him. We were acquainted socially some years ago, but I do not consider myself a professional reference. Please let me know if you need any further information. I read it twice to be sure it was factual and unassailable. Then I sent it. After that, I called one of the partners in the department where he'd applied. This partner and I had worked closely for years. He knew my history, and he was someone I trusted to understand the context without judgment. When I explained that the applicant was an old acquaintance who had treated me poorly in the past, and that I didn't want any confusion about my support, he let out a low whistle. "The nerve," he said. "Good for you. Thanks for the heads up." We had a brief, cathartic laugh about the audacity of someone who thought they could ignore me when it suited them and then casually expect a favor years later. I hung up feeling strangely light. I didn't need to do anything else. No scathing reply to his email. No call-out on social media. I didn't need revenge in the form of drama. Just the quiet satisfaction of knowing he would never get to assume he could use my name like a stepping stone. For once, that was enough. After I sent the email to HR and spoke with the partner, I half expected some sort of immediate fallout. Maybe he'd try to call me directly. Maybe he'd send a follow-up email demanding to know why I hadn't responded. But there was nothing. Just silence. I wondered if he assumed I'd quietly complied, the way he probably assumed I'd quietly tolerated his behavior all those years ago. Part of me almost wished he would reach out, just so I could say out loud what I'd been thinking since the day he pretended I was invisible. You don't get to erase me when it's convenient and then resurrect our connection when it benefits you. But he didn't call. He didn't write back. I imagine he was too embarrassed to ask why he never got a response or an interview. A week later, I was in the kitchen at work, making coffee, when the HR coordinator popped her head in. "Hey," she said casually. "Thanks for clarifying about that applicant. We get people trying to leverage old connections more often than you'd think." I smiled. "No problem." She didn't elaborate and I didn't ask. But I knew exactly what she meant. His application had been quietly set aside. No interview scheduled. No further action. That was that. A few days later, I happened to glance at LinkedIn out of idle curiosity. His profile hadn't changed, still actively seeking new opportunities. I closed the tab without a second thought. In the past, I might have felt a little guilty. I'd been trained my whole life, especially as a woman, to avoid making people uncomfortable, even when they deserved it. But now I felt something closer to relief, because it wasn't just about him. It was about reclaiming the right to set boundaries, about not letting old dynamics dictate how I showed up in my own professional life, and about refusing to be manipulated by nostalgia for a time that, if I was honest, hadn't been nearly as mutual as I once believed. What surprised me most was how quickly it all faded from my mind after that. The person who once took up so much emotional space had become a footnote, an example I might share over drinks with a friend when we were trading stories about other people's audacity. It didn't consume me. It didn't linger. It was just done. Occasionally, one of the few old acquaintances who still stayed in touch would mention him in passing, usually as part of some anecdote about how he was still drifting from one job to the next. And every time, I'd think the same thing. Some people never learn how to treat others with basic respect. And when life stops rewarding them for it, they're always surprised. But I wasn't. I'd seen exactly who he was the moment he turned his back on me at that event. This was just the final proof. It's funny how small moments can define entire chapters of your life. For years, I thought the most defining moment of that old friend group was the night he turned away from me in the VIP lounge, pretending I wasn't there. I thought that would always be the memory that stung most. The clear signal that when my presence became inconvenient, people who once shared my table and laughed in my kitchen could so easily discard me. But in hindsight, it wasn't that moment that defined things. It was this one. The moment he tried to reappear, acting as though nothing had happened, expecting my help without so much as an acknowledgement of the past. That was when I realized just how far I'd come. Because a former version of me might have given him the referral anyway, out of habit, or a misguided desire to be the bigger person. That old part of me might have worried about seeming petty or vindictive. Might have told myself that refusing to help was somehow evidence of being bitter. But standing there in my kitchen after that call to HR, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt free. Free of the pressure to please people who didn't value me. Free of the expectation that I should always be gracious, no matter how I was treated. Free of the belief that my worth was measured by how useful I could be to others. It turns out that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't to fight or explain or demand an apology. Sometimes the most powerful thing is to calmly close the door and not look back. I didn't need revenge that left a visible mark. I didn't need an audience to validate that I was right. The simple act of refusing to lend my name to someone who had so thoroughly disregarded me was enough. And that's what I wish I'd known all those years ago. You don't have to set yourself on fire to keep other people warm. You don't have to pretend you weren't hurt just because time has passed. You don't have to be available to people who only remember you when they need something. It's okay to be done. It's okay to move on. And it's absolutely okay to say, no. Even now, when I think about it, I don't feel anger. I feel clarity. The clarity that comes from understanding that boundaries aren't about punishing someone else. They're about respecting yourself. He may never understand why I refused to help him, but I do, and that's all that matters.